Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk 2021. If you have any questions during the presentations today, you can type them into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. If you're wanting a recording for this, there'll be recordings will be shared later on this afternoon, and I'll share that with you then. So thank you, and Lionel, take it away.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the February 17th edition of Crop Talk. And this week, we're continuing with our updates on getting ready for the growing season. And this week, I'm glad to have Kim Brown-Livingston on. She is our department's new weed specialist, and she is one person that has worked with the department before and went back to private industry, and now we're glad to have her back because she has a ton of experience, and she'll definitely fit the role as the provincial wheat specialist for Manitoba Ag. So glad to have her back. And I guess with that, we're going to start the webinar. And Lori, if you can hand the screen over to Kim, we'll get started.
We're good. Are we good to go, Lori?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you guys so much for having me on. Thank you, Lori, for helping me get this set up, and for Lionel for getting me going on my webinars. And Lionel saying I have a ton of experience is just very nice for saying I'm old. And so I've been here before. I was in this role quite a while ago when we still had 2 weed specialists in the province. And that was a few years ago, from 98 into the early mid-2000s. I think we still had 2 weed specialists. And then yeah, since then I've had a good stint in industry, which has been really great. Got to work with some really great industry people and some really great farmers. And now I'm back doing weeds. So I'm going to give you a bit of a weed update. I've just been back for a couple of weeks now, and this is pretty general. I'd like to get into some more nitty gritty later on in the year when we get into the season, but this is just kind of a bit of a general thing to start the year off. We're just in February here, so I think this is a good start to our year for weeds updates. So planning for the 2021 season, what happened in 2020? And again, my last 10 years, I've been really up in Northwest Manitoba in the Dauphin area, in Swan River, working a bit in Saskatchewan as well. But so my last 10 years have been primarily working in that area, but I do have lots of family in Southern Manitoba. So I get down here. I did spend a lot of time down here too. So in 2020, basically all over the province, less precipitation than normal, other than some catastrophic events, which in the Dauphin area, we had 8 to 10 inches of rain in some places pretty much within 24-hour period. And but other than that, we were actually quite dry. Some areas had drowned out crops and some very weedy fields, and some areas actually did really well. Overall, though, we did pretty well. And yields, especially for our cereals in lots of places, were really good. Our canola crops were a little bit challenged because they did get a little bit weedy. In places, it was kind of hit and miss. It would be a pocket of some pretty terrible fields, and then there was some really good fields too. So overall, pretty good. Now, we all, though, did have a fairly dry fall. There is, again, pockets that maybe got a bit more rain than others, but for some places it was too dry for tillage. Some people didn't get anything sprayed. It just depends. It's really, as I've phoned around the province, talking to our ag reps, then everybody has a different story, because every area seemed to have a little bit of a different story as to what actually went on with weed control in the fall. So having said that, though, here again, we did have, this is our percent of normal precipitation. We were below normal, especially in the fall here. We did have quite a dry fall. This is our soil moisture survey. This is in the top 30 centimeters. You can see here the reds is obviously the very dry, and we do have some pockets of green, so again, it's kind of variable, but overall we were, I think a lot of us were on the drier side. This is in the top foot, basically the top 3 centimeters. If you look, this next one is in the 30 to 120 centimeters. So, we're going down a couple feet now. So this is our subsoil moisture, which is going to help support our crop growth through the season. So that's been replenished somewhat compared to the last couple of years, but our crops are going to be starting off right now, the way things are right now, in fairly dry soil, and our weeds are coming from that fairly dry soil as well. Now, having said that, we could get some big rains in the spring and we could be talking something completely different a couple months from now. But as it stands right now, we are on the dry side, especially in that top foot of soil, which is again where our crops need to start from and where our weeds are going to be starting from too. So if it's a dry spring, which like right now it looks like it, but it might not be, early weed control is crucial, especially for thin, non-competitive crops. Don't wait for more weeds to emerge. The ones that are there are competing for water and nutrients. And the weeds that are present, they can get out of staging while you're waiting for more to come. So we have seen this happen, and I've seen this with lamb's quarters particularly. It can just get out of control because there's not a lot of weeds there. You're waiting for more to come. And then later on in the year, we have some of these weeds that get pretty big because we've missed them. They were just too big when we did get in there to spray. And the longer the weeds are present, the greater the yield loss. So the critical weed-free period is different for every crop. Here, with something that's much more competitive, like a spring wheat crop, basically you really need to keep it clean in that 1 to 3 leaf stage. Canola, anywhere from 2 to the 4 to 6 leaf stage, it's got to be clean, and after that it starts to cabbage. And basically we're talking about covering the ground and we're shading out those weeds, we're covering the ground. By that point, our crop is using up the water and the nutrients, and we don't want, and there's a lot less chance for those weeds to get going. Soybeans, it takes a long time to get that stuff going. Even in solid seeded beans, you're still looking at emergence to the 3rd trifoliate leaf. So you've got a ways to go in that crop to keep it clean. And corn, you're basically 3 to 10 leaf stage. So again, those are our main crops that we're looking at right now. And your other cereals, your barley, your oats, your rye, very similar. In fact, if not, they're more competitive usually than a spring wheat. So they're the easiest ones to keep clean. Basically, once you've got 3 leaves on them, they're pretty good to go. I'm going to talk briefly again about herbicide-resistant weeds. We're going to talk about this a lot. In Canada, we have lots of herbicide resistance. Basically, pretty much name a species and there's pretty much resistance to it. In Manitoba, we've got obviously our wild oats, our green and our yellow foxtail, our barnyard grass, our wild mustard. You guys in the Southwest know particularly about the Kosher. Chickweed, cleavers, hemp nettle, shepherd's purse, stinkweed, your pigweeds are resistant as well. So again, this is just a map. There's a weed resistance. There's lots of information on weed resistance, but we have to keep hammering this home. We're not getting much new for chemistry, if anything. And we're basically the chemistry that we have is what we have to spray. And so we're going to have to make it work, and we're going to have to know what we've got resistance to. So again, this isn't going away. This started back in the late 80s, and we keep finding more weeds and more complex resistance, like resistance to multiple herbicide groups as we progress. This is the occurrence of herbicide-resistant wild oat in Manitoba. Again, back in 2002, this is based on the weed surveys. We do them at fairly regular intervals. We were slated to do one this year, but with COVID happening last year, Saskatchewan's weed survey didn't get done. And Saskatchewan was supposed to do in 2020, and Manitoba was slated to do our weed survey in 2021. That's all been pushed back for 1 year. So Saskatchewan will be doing theirs this year, and then we will be doing our weed survey in 2022. So you'll be hearing lots about that from me in the future. But anyways, in 2002, we were looking at 44% of fields had herbicide resistance. And if you look at the bars there, the red is group 1, wild oats group 1 resistant. Then group 2 is the blue bar, and then 8% of the fields had group 1 and 2 together. If you look in the next weed survey that was done in 2008, so basically 6 years later, they surveyed 300 fields, and you can see how our percentage of fields in general has jumped from 44 to 60%, and especially our group 1 resistance is getting up there. And then when we look in 2016, we see that almost 80% of our fields have herbicide resistance, and almost 80% of those as well have group 1 resistance. So this is, you know, we've been dealing with this for a while and it's getting worse. So we're just going to have to watch. In 2018, our weed of the year was Kosher. Again, you guys in Southwest Manitoba are really familiar with this weed. I'm familiar with it. There was a lot of this on my dad's farm when I grew up in the rivers area, and especially during those dry 80s when the soils were a little salty and there was a lot of Kosher around. These are a couple of maps. This is occurrence of glyphosate resistant Kosher in Manitoba. And basically, you can see the difference even in a couple of years. They had done some sampling to go and to actually test for herbicide resistance. So in 2016, you can see that the glyphosate resistant, and the map that's on the left-hand side there, the yellow, the municipalities that are in yellow had glyphosate resistance. And then in 2018, they had gone and done some sampling and found obviously that the glyphosate resistance is growing. And this is coming at us from the west. They had glyphosate resistant Kosher long before we did in Alberta, and it just basically moved from the west and moved into Manitoba, and it's everywhere. We've had group 2 resistant Kosher for quite a while, but this glyphosate resistant has been here for a while now too. So and again, when we do our weed survey in 2022, we'll be sampling these things again. So the occurrence of glyphosate-resistant Kosher in Alberta, basically this, I'll tell you, in 2017, they did 305 sites, and they sampled them post-harvest in September and October. They basically found glyphosate-resistant Kosher almost everywhere in 15 out of the 16 municipalities. 100% of that Kosher was resistant to group 2. That's not a surprise. 50% of that was resistant to glyphosate. And this is the ugly bit, is that 8% was resistant to group 4, which is dicamba. And that's been one of our products that's still working for us here. To my knowledge, we don't have dicamba resistant Kosher, but again, I'm not sure. In the last year, there may have been some samples that have that are starting to test positive. But as of last year, we did not have dicamba tolerance yet. And overall, there was 10% of the samples were resistant to all 3 of those. So in 2018, again, this is going back a couple of years now, 300 collected the same amount of testing, and they basically found that 59% of the samples were glyphosate resistant. So we're, and basically a range of crops. So all the crops were sampled. So it was in soybean fields, it was in corn fields, it was in canola, other oil seeds, cereals, pulses, even alfalfa grass fields, and other areas. And so basically growers are going to have to shift their Kosher management programs because, the glyphosate resistance is here. And thankfully, we still have a couple of products that are working for us quite well. We need to increase the reliance on alternative herbicides, basically pre-emergence, adoption of herbicide-resistant crops that have stack resistance traits so that we can actually spray multiple chemistries on that same crop. And that'll give us another bang at our buck to get some of this Kosher out of there. And integration of non-chemical tools into current weed control programs. And so again, it's we're not going to be able to just spray this stuff out. And I'm going to get to some of this a bit later in the talk. Here's our glyphosate-resistant Kosher map in 2018, and you can basically see based on the color of the dot, the darker the dot, the higher the resistance. And you can zoom in on any part of that map. If you zoom in here, this is basically where I'm sitting, in Carmen today and looking at the area around us. And it's not Manitoba, it's all of Manitoba. So what about the pigweeds? You've heard a lot about these in the last year or two, basically since 2019, and they're getting pretty ugly too. So is it herbicide resistance or environmental influence? Pigweeds in general can be very aggressive weeds. They can grow anywhere. They've got a lot of things that make them a very good weed. But basically in 2002, they found a very small amount of group 2 herbicide resistant pigweeds. In 2016, they found more. And by 2018, basically, we're looking at group 2 resistant red root pigweeds. So again, we're just talking about red root right now. was confirmed in 4 out of 5 samples. So again, not a lot of samples there, but definitely our group 2 resistance is growing, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast for group 2 resistance. It comes on pretty quick once it starts. In 2019, our weed of the year was water hemp, and there's a link here to, there's YouTube videos. There's lots of videos on identifying the difference between red root pigweed and tall water hemp, and then Palmer amaranth as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Here's a screenshot of a tweet from Tammy Jones, our former weed specialist, that they had found tall water hemp in Manitoba. Now, this is a tier 1 noxious weed, which means it gets eradicated without condition, which is exactly how it sounds. This is what it looks like. And more than 20 plants per square foot can reduce soybean yields by 44%. In Ontario, it's causing a yield loss in corn of up to anywhere from the average is 18% up to 84% yield loss in corn. And it can cause an average yield loss in Ontario. It's caused 43% yield loss, but it can cost up to 93% of yield loss. So this stuff is ugly. Excuse me. Sorry. How many amaranth seeds, and the amaranth family is the pigweed family. The seeds are impossible to tell apart. If you have a small, shiny black seed, it's one of the amaranths. It's really, you would not be able to tell which one it is, and you'd have to grow them out. So on that dime, there's about 70 seeds. So again, finding contamination in crop seed lots is almost impossible. And how many amaranth seeds are in that little vial, which is smaller than a AA battery, or anyways, it may be about the same size. I guess that vial's a little bit wider, but that is almost 44,000, just 43,500 seeds in that container. So seed contamination is a major concern. This is our red root pigweed versus our water hemp. Red root pigweed's got a really hairy stem. Water hemp is smooth, and same as Palmer amaranth. They have a smooth stem. They do not have these bristly hairs, so they're pretty easy to tell apart that way. Water hemp, again, this is a tier 1 weed. It's a summer annual. It's a C4 plant, so it's a heat-loving plant. It's dioecious, which means it has male plants and female plants. This means it can outcross, and there's a lot of genetic variability in that plant, and the same as Palmer amaranth. That also is a dioecious plant, whereas something like a red root pigweed is a monoecious, so the male parts and the female parts are on the same plant. So again, when you see some of this stuff, which I hope you don't get to see it, but you probably will see some water hemp, you will see the plants look a little bit different, whether they're male or female. It's got wind dispersed pollen. It's viable up to 0.5 kilometer. Viable seed usually 14 days after pollination. So this thing is scary because it can start setting seed fairly early in the year, and that seed can be viable. It can be a prolific seed producer. It's capable of producing over 1 million seeds, but it averages probably in that 300,000. You'll see lots of different numbers, but you'll see anywhere between 400 to 800,000 seeds per plant. It's a lot, doesn't really matter, but it is capable of doing up to 1 million seeds on some of these monster plants that are left alone and don't have any competition. It germinates all through the summer, especially in reduced tillage systems. And again, we've been in a drier cycle lately. I know we have got a lot of guys cutting down on the amount of tillage operations just to conserve water for that growing crop and, for the next year's crop type thing. So this is an issue that we have to watch. One good thing is it's typically a fairly short-lived seed, usually less than 5 years. So if, we can not let that seed bank build up too much, then this is something that those seeds aren't viable for that long compared to some of the other weed species. So so growth rate is 50 to 70% greater than many other annual weeds. And again, it's a C4 plant, which is like a warm season plant. So think of something like corn. Corn, you can practically hear that stuff growing overnight when it gets nice and warm. And this plant is very similar. There are multiple herbicide resistant biotypes, anywhere from group 2, 4, 5, 9, 14, 15, and 27. We don't have that here yet, but that's what people in other places in the world are dealing with. identified in 4 RMs in Manitoba in 2019. That's when we first found this thing. We suspect group 2 and group 9. At the time, that was what was suspected based on what had been sprayed, and the pigweed just grew right through it. Possibly group 5 because of atrazine use in the Corn Belt in the States. But we see rapid plant establishment along the field perimeters, standing water, and drainage ditches. So water hemp, and water hemp in the name, it likes water. It likes to grow where it's been a bit wetter. So if you're going to find it, it's going to be in the wettest areas of the field, or the field edges, or the ditches, or that type of thing. So here's our water hemp distribution map in 2019, and you'll see it's concentrated on the eastern side of the province there. This is a weed that's moving north and west, versus our kochia was moving basically eastward, coming from Alberta and Saskatchewan and moving into Manitoba. But our water hemp weed, especially the weed itself, is coming from the south, and it's moving north and west. There is a red circle around Dauphin there. That is because we found one plant last year. Actually, I found it. One of my farmers that I was working with in the area called me because he had a plant that was over 7 feet tall. And I figured I knew what it was basically just by him telling me that he had a weed in the field that had survived spraying and was over 7 feet tall. So I got there, it was definitely a water hemp plant, and it had been sprayed it was in a Clearfield canola field, so it had been sprayed with group 2, obviously, and it had grown right through that. It was also surrounded by a bunch of kochia, which really hadn't been on the farm there before, and it was waist-high kochia in a patch as well. But even in waist-high kochia, this water hemp plant was still 7 feet tall. And we just found the one, and we've got this, we'll be monitoring the site for the next couple of years. Who's going back to a cereal crop this year, so hopefully we'll be able to spray it out of there. Group 4 should, any of the group 4s right now should be doing a good job on that, because we don't have resistance here to that yet. So again, here some of these, we had done some herbicide resistance testing on this water hemp, and they found, if you look at the red bar there, they had in 6 different fields, basically almost all of it was group 9 resistant, and we've got some of it was group 2 resistant, most of it was as well. So we've got basically group 9. The good news is so far nothing on group 14s, which is really good news because we're still able to use that product. And yeah, and the group 5, nothing yet. We don't have a lot of group 5s used in Manitoba, but in the corn, well, overall in Manitoba we don't, but definitely where guys are growing corn, there's still a lot of atrazine use, and that's where we're going to see that group 5 resistance come on pretty strong in those corn areas. This is the North Dakota distribution. So, I mean, if you can look at the border of the map and you see where Manitoba is, basically this stuff is all the way up to the Manitoba border. It's all through Minnesota. It's just a matter of time before we find some of it. Basically, we've got to get at this weed other ways than just spraying it. Crop canopy closure will reduce germination and competition from water hemp. And I'm going to go through a few of these slides later on too, just to talk about some general management issues, but particularly for water hemp, using soil residual herbicides, multiple modes of action, I guess multiple modes of effective action, because we have some herbicide groups that aren't working obviously already. Narrow row spacings, inter-row cultivation, cover crops, increased seeding rates. Crop rotation is a big one to be able to put a crop in there that we can still spray it out of. Machinery sanitation, again, that's a tough one. We should be doing that anyways, but these are tiny, tiny little seeds, and they do get moved around. Destruction of weed patches, we've got to do that. We have to do that. In Ontario, our counterparts are estimating water hemp control costs are running between $45 and $60 an acre. That's just cost that they have to bear now because they have water hemp. And if you want to grow a crop, you're going to be spending that kind of money to get rid of it. That's why we'd rather it not get here at all, or when it does get here, we get rid of it. We don't let it get away on us. That's why eradication is the ultimate goal, and it's also the law. This is a tier 1 noxious weed, and it's eradicated. That is the law. Basically, herbicide resistance spreads in multiple ways. A lot of it is spreading. Our combines are running them through the field. They're finding a lot of these weeds maybe moving basically in our waterfowl. I'll just here, seeds recovered from the digestive tracts of ducks and geese harvested during a 2-year field study had 35,000 plants emerge. The viability rate and gut retention times indicated potential dispersal of these weed seeds up 2,900 kilometers. So basically 3,000 kilometers away, and a duck can still be depositing weed seeds. So these things, that's why these things are moving north. And so the conclusions of this study, they confirmed that waterfowl are consuming the seeds from a variety of agronomically important weed species, including Palmer amaranth, including water hemp, which can remain viable after passage and have potential to be dispersed. So we think this is maybe how some of these have been coming here to Manitoba. Honestly, it doesn't really matter how they got here. Once they get here, they have to be eradicated, and it's they can get, these weeds are, they could be coming with contamination in seed lots as well. There's multiple ways they can get here. The cost of herbicide resistant weeds. In the current year, there's the crop loss from competition, unmarketable product or lower value product because of dockage. In the future, we're looking at that seed bank building up in the soil for future crops to be, growing on that same field with these weeds coming up. We're talking about land values. If something is polluted with herbicide-resistant wild oats or herbicide-resistant Kosher or herbicide-resistant water hemp, that's bound to affect, that will affect its long-term productivity. And again, the land value will reflect that. It just makes everything more complex. We have to do a lot of other things to manage these weeds other than just spray something. And this this water hemp here is after 2 herbicide applications, so it's obviously not doing a whole heck of a lot. Here is 2,4-D right now is working quite well. Typically has good activity on water hemp, so again, in a cereal crop, we should be able to take this thing out. Staging is important though, we gotta get it when it's small. In our corn crops, the picture on the right is Shield X 400 SC. Can't remember the chemical name of it, but it's a new group 27, topyrolate, I think it is. Anyways, it's a group 27. It's in our corn crops. It's doing really well on the smaller weeds. It's either control or suppression depending on the size of the weed. This is working really well for now, and it's going to work really well until it doesn't. Because if guys are doing corn, and spraying Shield X, it's not going to work after a while, and that's going to come on pretty quick. This is a picture. You can see the taller, darker weeds in the back here are, we're kind of on the edge of a field here, and you can see those taller, darker weeds. This is it after it was weeded out. Here's Tammy, again, our former weed specialist, with a pile of water hemp plants that were hand weeded out. 4 hours of labor at $50 an hour, that's 200 bucks. Pulled out about 300 plants, and even conservatively saying there was 10,000 seeds on those 300 plants. That's a lot of seeds. So that's a lot of seeds that have been pulled out. They've left the farm, though that weed patch would have been burnt, and those weed seeds should have been destroyed. So this is just to show, this is June 2019. This is an aerial photo of that piece of land. This is what it was polluted with. Here's July 2019. This is where I think about 35 acres, I think, were destroyed. They actually had to take they had to take this land out of production because it was so polluted with weeds, and you can see what it looks like there. It was just absolutely polluted with water hemp, and it had to be destroyed. So now 35 acres removed from production. Yes, that is production that's gone. It's lost from the farmer's pocketbook. And so even looking at seed and fertilizer costs, there's about $9 grand in there. You would have had to add in the rental cost. Even if you own it, you should be adding in that cost. There was the cost of keeping those 35 acres weed free. So there's obviously, this has cost the farmer some money. However, if you looked at even 20 plants per square foot and a conservative estimate at 10,000 seeds per plant, you're looking at 200,000 seeds per square foot. Per acre, you're looking at over 8 billion seeds per acre. And when you times that by 35 acres that this farmer had to destroy, that's a really big amount of seeds. And again, most of those were, we don't know how many of those are viable, but a lot of them are. Most of them are viable. And that's what breaks the bank, not the $9,000 of lost crop and the lost land rental and the mowing and, the cost to keep it clean. That's what's going to break the bank, especially in the future, is that weed seed bank. And then again, we do some tillage. We run a combine through that. We spread those weed seeds all over. We do a little bit of tillage. We spread some more weed seeds, and all of a sudden it's not 35 acres, it's 70 or 100. The cost of herbicide resistant weeds, they're not easy to manage. They can cause substantial increases in herbicide costs. Programs have to be constantly changing because multiple resistance will develop over time, and that's not can develop, that's will develop. The trend for palmer, amaranth, or water hemp to develop resistance to any new herbicide sites of action that are used in post-treatments is about 3 cycles of use. So you get to use that chemistry 3 times, and then you're done. If that's the only thing you're doing. If you're adding in more layers and you're doing more cultural things, that's hopefully we can extend that. But if you are just going to switch chemistries and find something new that's going to kill this weed, you've got about 3 shots at it before we start to develop resistance. Improving the odds. In Australia, they're doing a lot of harvest weed seed management. They're using that Harrington seed destructor, the Redicop seed terminator. They're using chaff cart, chaff lining. They're doing a lot with just keeping those weed seeds from spreading once they're on the field. In the Midwest US, they're using cover crops. They'll enhance herbicide efficacy, and they have showed that there's some savings, but again, there's pros and cons to every system. There's obviously going to be more cost to all of these systems, and it's just a question of figuring out what's the best thing, and it's probably not one best thing, it's a combination of things that we need to start looking at, do other things other than chemical control. So again, this is what this can look like. This weed, if you see a weed like this, you need to call somebody. Call me, call somebody. We need to do something about this. So no, this is a slogan. I've got a bunch of these magnetic, they're like bumper stickers. They're on my desk. They're on my filing cabinet. No pigweed left behind. Go rogue and stop the seed. This is basically, we're going to have to do some hand weeding when we start to see these things. So just very quickly, in weed management, there's, we look at a combination of ways to control weeds: cultural control, mechanical control, biological control, and chemical control. And we're not, we're obviously going to be using chemical control in our main crops. Our biological control is, not really going to work for us in the crops that we grow, but for some other areas that does work. But I've kind of highlighted the cultural control and even the mechanical control to some point. We've got to start doing more on these management methods, because our chemical control method is going to fall apart if that's the only one we're using. So our cultural control methods are crop rotation, the crop including the variety. And again, we see this in our canola crops with our different herbicide tolerant systems. Even some of the other canolas that we're used to, our in-vigor canolas, get out of the ground, get growing really quick in the spring. They just seem to get a bit of a jump ahead of some of our other varieties. And so just things to be aware of. If you're growing a different variety, if it's a different chemistry system that it's tolerant to, then we need to know what we're using for our chemistry, but we also need to be watching it. And some of our canolas, they need to be managed just a little bit more carefully in the spring because they're just a little slower to go. Anything that, if they're a little slower out of the ground and they're a little slower to get started, sometimes we have a bit more flea beetle pressure on them. Cutworms, the same thing. And sometimes some of these crops tend to be, they can be not as competitive as, some of our other canola crops. So using certified seed when we're talking about our cereals and things like that, our seeding date, our seeding rate, our row width, our fertilization, all of those things are really important. We basically have to do everything we can to grow the best, most competitive crop we can. And that will help our chemistry options work the best they can in that crop. For crop competitiveness, our cereals are our most competitive. Rye is our most competitive, followed by oats, then barley, then wheat, then canola, then peas, soybean, flax, and lentil. Basically, those crops are, once you get even your soybean crop, once it gets up and covers the ground, it's good, but it takes a long time to cover that ground. Just even looking at variety, taller crops are more competitive than shorter crops. Leafier are more than, or leafier, the leafier the crop, the better. Basically, we want rapid emergence, we want good vigor, we want to get that crop up out of the ground, we want to cover the ground, and we want to get going. And get that crop going as best we can. Seeding date, usually it depends. Now, sometimes earlier seeding is better, sometimes later seeding is better. That depends. If we're going to a later seeding date, that gives you the option to do a pre-seed burn off, and that also gives you the option to do some tillage in there if that's an option for you as well. So again, there's pros and cons to both of those. Seeding rates, usually, like, we would recommend higher seeding rates to get those crops to get more competitive and just physically more plants. Then if we lose a few, either to wireworms or something in a cereal, maybe a bit to frost first thing in the spring, with our canola crops, if we've got flea beetles, which we always seem to have, or cutworms, if you've got more plants out there, you still have a lot of plants left to cover the ground and to be competitive, even if we lose a few. And row width, again, for things like our row crops, you can see our crop there on the left has covered the ground a lot more quickly than our crop on the right. Fertilization, now I think most of our farmers are do really well at this, and in Manitoba we're actually very efficient with our fertilizers, and most of our fertilizer is banded. Although having said that, we do have some options with some of our nitrogen fertilizer, our enhanced efficiency fertilizers that can be broadcast. But overall, basically, if you're banding your fertilizers, especially your nitrogen, that will reduce the weed scavenging that nitrogen at the surface, and that is an advantage to your crop. And if you're irrigating, drip irrigation is better than broadcast irrigation because it targets that actual row rather than letting everything get the water and let the weeds grow as well. And crops that fix their own nitrogen have an advantage over weeds in low nitrogen soils. So again, for something like a soybean or a pea, there's an advantage there, but again, they still have to cover that ground and get everything going. So that was about all I had on just basically getting, a weeds update. Lionel had asked me, had said there was a few questions come in, and I think one of them was, what do we do for cleavers in flax? Not sure. If you could see my face, I'd probably be making a face right now because there's not a lot you can do. Basically, your authority is going to be your best shot at that. You've got suppression. Other than that, you don't have a lot. If you've got emerged cleavers, if you've got overwintered cleavers, then a pre-seed burn down will definitely help with that. And so any of your products that you can use pre-seed ahead of flax, but in crop, your options are limited in your authorities pre-seed anyways. But basically, yeah, your authority is about the only thing you've got that's going to give you some suppression. If you look at that table, which is from last year's Guide to Crop Protection, that's table 9. Those are your in-crop options, and there's really nothing in that column for cleavers. So that's a really tough one. Then Lionel had asked again, there was another people were asking questions about herbicide resistant kochia pre-seed options. Your herbicide kochia can be group 9, 2, and 4 resistant. We don't have that resistant group 4s here yet. So for us, our dicamba is still working. Sulfentrazone, which is authority, that is just, that is excellent kochia product. We have to be careful how much we're using authority. We don't want to be using it in front of a lot of different crops because we want to save that chemistry. Would recommend that we only use it no more than 1 every 2 years. It does have a registration now ahead of wheat, so it can be used ahead of wheat, but also it may be the only product ahead of some of our other crops like flax. So we need to make sure we're using it there, and then maybe take a look at our long-term rotation and see where else we can use it. There's also flumioxazin, which is a group 14, and that's in Fierce and Volterra. Now, those are not in last year's table. This is, again, our control of emerged weeds before seeding or after seeding, but prior to crop emergence. This is table 14B in our guide from last year. And basically I've highlighted the Kosher column and all the products that are listed that have Kosher. The Fierce and the flumioxazin products, the Fierce and the Valterra aren't in this table, but they will be this year. And anyways, you can see there's still some options, especially if you've got dicamba. We don't have the dicamba tolerant or dicamba resistant Kosher yet. Then our Occurrence and products, any products containing dicamba will still work. We've got suppression from some products, but basically, you know, again, you're looking at that authority would still be, you know, a very good Kosher product, but we have to be really careful how that's used. And that's about all I had. Just wondering if there's any other questions or what else you guys wanted to talk about.
Okay, good. Great job, Kim. There is a few questions that have come in. One thing I'm going to ask you before we leave the authority thing, is there concern of an authority buildup in the soil that we should be watching for?
It's in the guide and it's in the label. It's once every 2 years. So yeah, there is, that's, I guess, part of it. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be using it every single year for a number of reasons too. I mean, it's one of the few products we can use in some crops, and you don't want to be abusing it just because. I mean, I think it's great that it can be used ahead of wheat now, but I wouldn't want to be using it ahead of wheat and flax and soybean, like everything. You just need to save that. But the label says once every 2 years. So if we're following that label, we should be fine. And again, we should be doing probably at least that once every 2 years or once every 3 years, just to preserve that chemistry. Because there is group 14 resistance in a lot of other weeds in a lot of other places. Not so much in Manitoba yet, basically nothing in Manitoba yet, just because we have not been using these chemistries for very long. So that's a really good thing.
Okay, another one here, group 15 herbicides can work really well on pigweeds. Are group 15s part of the resistance scan on water hemp?
The water hemp, there is, yes, not here yet, but that is one. I think it's resistant to up to 9 herbicide groups, and group 15 is one of them. But again, these are areas that have been using the group 15s for a lot longer than we have. So it is possible. If we start using a lot of group 15s, yes, we probably will get resistance. It's just a matter of when. But so far we don't have that here. We're very lucky. So far we've just seen the group 9, so the glyphosate, the group 2 resistance, and possibly some atrazine resistance, but I have to find out on that one. But it's that would be again coming from areas that we're using some group 5 resistance, which would be coming from atrazine, but the group 15, not yet, I guess, is probably the best answer, not yet.
Okay, another question, is there the best pre-emerged herbicide for control of volunteer canola and Roundup tolerant soybeans?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's multiple options there, like even heat, like a lot of people have used heat. There's lots of options. I think again, that's a group 14. We need to start looking at where we're using some of these. If we're using them ahead of some of our crops, but then are we using them as a harvest aid as well? So we want to kind of be watching how much we're using certain chemistries and where. But yeah, like if you look in the guide, I'll just take a look. And like I said, that table 14B in the guide, it probably will be the same table going forward, and our guides should be out in a few weeks, we're hoping. Definitely they'll be out by the end of March, and they could be out like by middle of March, we're hoping actually. But yeah, but if you're looking at in soybeans, you've got quite a few, you've got lots of different, not lots, but there's definitely some options, and we definitely have some canola control, volunteer canola control options there. Your in-crop options, that is something too that you have to be making sure, like even if you haven't had a lot of Roundup or glyphosate tolerant canola grown on the farm, that doesn't mean it's not growing there as a weed in your soybean crop. So I think you really, really need to be targeting a product that also gets your volunteer canola out in crop. And I know I had worked with a lot of soybean growers, and we still had a lot of guys that were just going into a soybean crop with just glyphosate. And you will find a lot of volunteer canola will come through that because it's glyphosate resistant volunteers. So definitely a product up front and definitely a product in crop. You need to be throwing something in with that glyphosate to preserve the glyphosate as well. We shouldn't be spraying glyphosate alone ever unless there's no option to throw something. You know, if there is no option, then we do. But if you've got an option to put a product in with glyphosate, that will help preserve that chemistry as long as possible. So.
Okay, and just a follow up to that, how late can I spray volunteer canola in Roundup Ready soybeans? So I'm assuming how late of an application of Roundup or glyphosate can happen in a crop of soybeans.
Yeah, again, you kind of have to watch your labels and stuff, but I know you basically, once flowering starts, you need to be not burning off the flowers. I think with the volunteer canola, you kind of have to know, I guess you have to try to have a good idea of when it's coming up. If you're going to use a product like Viper, you get to use it once. And normally a nice thing about Roundup Ready or glyphosate tolerant soybeans is you can spray glyphosate in there 3 times if you want. You've got time and you can do that. You get to throw in something like a Viper once, and so you need to try to time that to make sure, like, am I doing it on my first in-crop spray? Am I doing it on my second? Because you won't get any residual on that. So you want to time that when you think most of your canola is up. You can go as late as flowering. You can maybe go a little bit later than that, but I don't like to. But you need to, the Roundup Ready gene is very good in the soybeans, like it's quite safe, but basically by flowering, you need to be done. And when you're doing multiple applications of glyphosate in Roundup Ready soybeans, you need to be giving yourself time in between for the crop to recover. Tolerant, it's not immune. So if you give yourself, you need to be looking at a 10-day interval in between sprays. So you need to kind of have an idea of when you're going to start that first spray, that second spray. I mean, I would always do 2 sprays in crop, and then just a question of which one of those you're going to throw in that product to take out those other weeds and to help preserve our glyphosate. Give yourself time. And like I said, give yourself that 10 days in between. But you can go quite late if you need to, but having said that, the earlier they get the weeds out of there, the better, usually.
Okay. Okay, question back to water hemp. Does it prefer a certain soil type?
That I don't know. It does seem to grow everywhere. The water hemp, though, will grow where it's a bit wetter. So if we've got big, dry, sandy areas that tend to just not be very wet, that's not the first place I'd see water hemp, but you will get water hemp growing there. You're going to see your Palmer amaranth come in on your drier soils, but in general, to my knowledge, there's not anything that says it prefers like a clay soil over a sandy soil, other than it does like the wet areas. So we see it first usually on the wetter fields, which tend to be the heavier soils usually, but not always. You can get some wet sands that just have high water tables, and they can be quite soggy, especially when we've had a lot of rain. But we do see it on the edge of the fields and the ditches, in drainage ditches especially. Anybody that's got drainage ditches coming through their land, and especially any of those, here in eastern Manitoba where that water's coming from the south, that's where we're seeing, it's not a surprise that that's where the water hemp first showed up, was on those fields. And again, those tend to be heavier land, but that's not necessarily why the water hemp's there.
Okay, and I got one more just now. Who enforces the destruction of these plants? Is it an RM responsibility?
Yeah, the Noxious Weeds Act is a provincial regulation, and Manitoba Agriculture, we help administer the act. But the RM, has the teeth, I guess, to do that. So we work at Manitoba Agriculture, we work with the RMs, and the RMs either will appoint a weed supervisor and have a weed district. And if they don't do that by law, they have to appoint a weeds inspector. They have to let us know who that is. And so every RM has a person on staff. Either they formed a weed district and they've hired somebody like a weed supervisor, and some of you folks are lucky enough to be in areas that have weed supervisors. So usually, your ditches are a lot less weedy than others, and you've got that person working in your RM. It's usually several RMs will go together to hire a weed supervisor, but every RM, by law, then has to have at least a weed inspector. Lots of times that's just maybe one of the counselors has been appointed, or it could be one of the municipal employees, and they are tasked with enforcing the Noxious Weeds Act. So we would work with them, and it would have to be, and to enforce that act. But yeah, it's provincial legislation. They are bound by law to enforce it.
Okay, good. Well, one more comment was just awesome job, Kim. And thanks a lot for the presentation. It was really well done. A lot of good information going into the growing season. I don't think we have any more questions, so I'm going to continue on with the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Before we go too much farther, though, I wanted to give you Kim's contact information. There's her phone number, 1431-344-0239, and her email address is there. And so if you have any questions for her or want to get in contact with Kim, just give her a call or send her an email, or if you didn't get time to write it down, you can just get a hold of myself or Lori, and we can definitely get you in contact with Kim. I wanted to mention again that WATO is looking for a summer research assistant, and it's coming closer to the deadline for applications, March 1st. There is the information as to getting a hold of Scott Chambers, who's the manager, and send your information to him. And the list of the farm production extensive specialists in Manitoba here. And again, if you need to get a hold of any of our specialists, or you have questions that you want some answers to, give any of us a call, and we'll definitely work with you to get the answers for your questions. Regarding your CCA credits, there's the information they're sending your stuff into. And I guess with that, join us next Crop Talk on February the 24th. And we're going to start getting into some of the pulse and soybean crops. So please join us next week, February the 24th. Thanks for attending.